Hello, everyone. My name is Corey Thornton. I'm the Senior Editor for the Open Minds Market Intelligence team, and I would like to welcome you to today's Circle Elite Executive Roundtable, Strategies for Strengthening Financial Sustainability, the Little Friends Approach. This roundtable is part of our Open Minds CFO Consortium series developed to provide executives with the tools to assess their organizations for long-term sustainability and growth. For today's roundtable, we feature Mike Briggs, President and Chief Executive Officer for Little Friends Incorporated, as well as Ken Carr, Open Minds Senior Associate. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping reminders. Your audio will be muted for today's briefing. However, we encourage you to submit questions using the chat box located on the right side of your screen. We address audience questions at the end of the presentation. And finally, the slides and recording for today's briefing will be available on the Open Minds website starting tomorrow. With that, here's Ken to get us started.
Thank you, Corey, and welcome to everyone in this CFO series webinar. It is really our pleasure today to have Mike Briggs from Little Friends, Inc. Looking forward to his presentation. As Mike and I have gotten to know each other, I've really been impressed by the depth of his experience coming out of for-profit work, having worked for IBM, having worked for his family company and then other manufacturing companies, growing them to over $100 million at certain points in time. Mike has a great deal of experience, and it has been great to hear how he's taken his experience in business overall and brought that to Little Friends to move forward with not just an assessment of how to strengthen the organization financially, but how to put together the plan, how to do the analysis, and in particular, how to move people through leadership through that process. And so, Mike, I'm looking forward to your presentation. And then after the presentation, having a bit of discussion with you as well. So, Mike, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll be back in just a few minutes, and we can engage in a few follow-up questions and see what questions our participants have as well.
Well, Ken, thanks so much for the introduction, and to those that are joining us today, thanks for making time. I do appreciate it, and truly hope that you find as you listen to me having the privilege of getting to tell our story, find some nugget in there that can help your organization that maybe you can apply and help make your business better, because in essence, that's the reason why I think you participate in things like this. At the last presentation where I gave this at the Institute meeting that was down in Clearwater, one of the things that I threw out as a challenge to the audience was to see if you could find a dollar value that would make it worth your while in terms of what you heard in the presentation. One of the things that I experienced years ago when I started going to things like this is someone challenged me to say, well, if your organization is going to invest, let's say, $10,000 for you to attend a course, you ought to come back with $100,000 worth of opportunities to improve the organization. And I thought it was an interesting way to begin to look at these things. And so while I realized that that kind of investment isn't necessarily going to be something that you're going to experience today, given that we're doing this over the internet, I will try to point out some things that have an economic value. And the idea would be that if it's something that can be of value to you, we can talk about it. I can tell you the things that we've done where maybe they've translated into something where it's been a nice thing to help the organization. So with that being said, the topic of the presentation today is building a sustainable organization. In terms of the purpose, really what we want to do is we want to deal with basic fundamentals in terms of where did we get started. Is we set in place plans to figure out how to survive, grow, and be profitable, because we want to talk about that. That really was the fundamentals as to how we looked at the organization, and in doing so, walk you through the process that we started and continue to follow. There are lessons that we've learned and are applicable, and I hope that as you watch later this afternoon and maybe with some questions that you're able to see which things could be applicable to you. In terms of what we'll try to do is I'll try to provide some historical perspective, because I can tell you, and if you read Monica's write-up about the session today, we were not in the best of shape when I came in, and we needed to create a plan, and I'll walk you through the steps we've done and continue to do, and give you a little bit of an assessment as to where we are today. My personal background, and some of it's applicable because I'm not a person who's grown up in social services. I graduated from college in the late 70s and immediately went into a career, was fortunate enough to get a job with IBM sales and was selling large scale computer equipment. And within a short window of time was asked to join a family business. And while I thought that I was going to have a 3-year runway to be able to learn the business and be able to do things within 90 days, was asked to be put in charge and run it. And admittedly, I was naive. I was certainly willing to compete, but boy, there were a lot of things that I didn't know, and really had to rely upon how I'd been managed at IBM as a framework and guideline as to what I wanted to do. Over the past over 30 years, then I ran 3 different manufacturing organizations, 2 that were privately held, 1 that was owned by private equity, which is interesting given private equity's involvement in our businesses now. But did that and retired in my late 50s, and then was asked to join the board of Little Friends in January of 2016. When that happened, I got actively involved because I thought that would be a fun thing to do. And in the short period in 2017, there was a need for a leadership change, and in essence was asked to unretire and come out and help run the business. I acknowledge I didn't have any experience in social services or nonprofit management, but I knew how to make money. I knew how to run a business, but with that framework, what I told our board was, if I don't work out, replace me fast if I stink at this. And it really goes back to a perspective that I think really is very important to have in any business decision, which is fail fast and fail cheap. When we looked at products that in the for-profit sector, when we look at things we're going to make, if it didn't work and there wasn't a market, get out. Don't, you tried, but at the same time, don't continue to pour good money after bad. And so the first thing that I shared with the board was, if I don't work, get out, and get me out fast. The second thing was, I made a commitment because I felt as though I had energy. And so I said I would stay in the job for no less than 5 years, but no more than 10. And it was really interesting. And I share this because what it created for me was a sense of urgency as to getting things done. In years past, when I would come into an organization, I always had this mindset that, I was going to take a short window of time, typically 90 days, do your assessment, and then begin to do modest change. In this situation, and the more I learned, the more it became very apparent to me that there needed to be a sense of urgency in terms of acting quickly. And so my own time frame, knowing that I was only going to be in a job for less than 5 years and no more than 10, gave me that perspective. And it was something that I think is I wish, quite honestly, that I'd had that same in the for-profit business. It was a wonderful lesson to learn. I didn't think it would be something I would learn, but I wish I'd done that when I was younger. How long I stay, quite honestly, relates to how much positive energy I can provide. And I will tell you, I'm a real big believer in that. I believe that good leaders generate and provide positive energy in terms of what happens. And so how you work with your team and what you do and how you make things happen, it enables me, I think, as part of my guidelines as to how do I determine how long I can stay. Now, in terms of the conditions of the business, in terms of where we were in March of 2017, we had an autism clinic. We operated at the time 3 schools. We had an adult day services program and operated 34 SILAs. The situation was, we had lost money for several years, and maybe some of you are out in the audience now and have experienced that. We were selling assets to partially cover losses. And we were pretty heavily into our credit line. And while we had assets to be able to, if you will, cover that if we sold it, the pace that we were on when we started really looking at what was going on is we were near a situation where if we kept this up for 3 more years, the likelihood of having enough assets to be able to generate revenues and cover losses, we were at a point where we would teeter and probably end up having to go away. But the bigger issue was we didn't know it. We didn't have visibility, and so we didn't have good information in terms of what was going on. And I use this slide because I could relate to it because Animal House was popular when I was in college, that tells you how old I am. And there's a time when John Belushi found out that his fraternity was going under, and his advice was to drink heavily. I thought it was funny, but it didn't get much of a joke or much of a laugh at the conference. But there were some things that had to happen when we realized that this was the challenge, and these were the problems. We knew we had to make changes to survive. We knew we had to have a plan. And again, speaking to that sense of urgency, something had to happen. So if you go by the premise, and really big picture was, how do we make sure we address in this order, having a plan to survive, having a plan to grow, and having a plan to be profitable. And for those of you that from being profitable, I really truly believe that you have to have margin to be able to cover your costs other than your people, because that enables you to be able to be sustainable. And so you have to be profitable in doing what we do. And so process-wise, what we did is we took a step back and we said, okay, let's look at 2 things. Let's look at the external markets and let's look at the internal markets. We'll start with the external first in terms of what were the trends, what was going on, where were there opportunities for growth, where were things underserved, and where did they represent potential. And then the other thing is, those that were considered good, what were they doing, and why were they doing what they were, and could we learn from that, and acknowledge that we didn't know, and if we weren't doing well and others were, what were those opportunities, and so begin to gather that kind of information. On the internal side, it really dealt with doing a SWOT analysis, and my guess is you all have done a SWOT analysis where you looked at the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats to the organization. But in going through this process, one of the things that I would say to you is that you have to go through it and do it in a manner where you take out the emotion that as you're looking at the organization, because oftentimes it's the emotion that clouds judgment in terms of being able to make the right business decision. And it's my wife and my kids joke with me when they ask me for advice, and I say, well, you got to take the emotion out of be able to think through it. And so it's a natural thing. It's not the easiest thing to do, but I will tell you, if you want to do an honest assessment and you want to look at your organization, deal with facts and take out the historical baggage that you may be going through or looking at that's causing you to reflect in a way that might not be the most accurate perspective that's going on in the business. It creates a very brutal but very honest evaluation, which from my vantage point is really something that you need if you're going to begin to really truly understand what lies before the organization. Now, if you look at in terms of the things that what did we need to do? We obviously we wanted to make sure that as we looked at the world, my take in terms of what I saw was that there were a number of organizations that were seeing some of the same challenges, and that the likelihood of consolidation was real. And I also thought that as I looked at the flow of monies, particularly in Illinois, in terms of how things were, that it really was unsustainable. And at some point, there's going to be a need for consolidation just because they can't continue to fund the administrative side of the organizations that are in existence. The other thing that became very apparent to me as I looked at and walked through the business was an incredible amount of waste existed, especially using paper and systems that didn't necessarily provide value to what we were trying to do. And so we took a real hard look from an organizational standpoint at how do we become more efficient, and then how do we lower our operating costs utilizing technology as the means to make that happen. You'll see reference to lean manufacturing, but lean manufacturing is really all about taking out waste and not doing things that that don't add value to what you're trying to do. It's not an overly complex idea, but if you just look at efficiencies and what can you do from a business standpoint to make your organization more efficient, I will tell you it can really be worth a tremendous amount in terms of your cost reductions and what you can do. And then the last thing from an organizational perspective is we made a commitment to becoming premier at what we did. And it was real simple. My experience is if you're not striving to be one of the best at where you're at, the survival of the fittest takes over, and your odds of survival are slim. And so whether it's for profit or non-for-profit, you want to be the best at what you can do, but it also creates a mindset that says, okay, we're gonna strive for doing better and continual improvement, which is all part of this. In the end, and I guess the message is that I really felt as though if we were going to survive, we had to take control of our own destiny, and part of this then became the mindset as to how we approached what we were trying to do. If you look in terms of the things that what's there in terms of other lessons, and it's interesting, by the way, because my picture's in the way of part of the slide, so I'm having to make sure that I can see this. But you really do have to understand the environments that you're working in, and you really need to understand what it's telling you. If you don't have a good perspective on the problems, it's very, very difficult to initiate change. The other thing that I would tell you is that that nonprofit, and I heard Monica say this, it's a tax status. But nonprofit doesn't mean that you don't have margin, and it doesn't mean you don't run as a business. And I will tell you that all of us are in businesses, and that we need to run like one, and that becomes the challenge in terms of what we're trying to make happen. And so the challenges at hand is, as we looked at what was there, is, you know, how do we leverage what we do well, and in particular meet the needs of both the individuals and families that we serve. And that was something that Little Friends has done well, and we wanted to make sure that we continued to do that. But how did we know we were doing well, and how did we know the impact that we were having? And it was interesting, as we began to ask these questions, we created some communication challenges and things that we needed to overcome, because what we realized is that people didn't know a lot about what we did, and we didn't have the adequate tools in place to be able to communicate to the marketplace the impact of our work. And so that became one of the things, but we also had some challenges with regard to how we were performing our services. And this slide here became something that was really, really powerful, is that, you know, how do we perform our services in a way where we do it with what we receive, rather than complaining about, well, we just don't get enough money to do that. We have to think differently to say, this is what we have, so how do we make this work? And then let's figure out what our options are. And maybe it's going to initiate change, but how do we do that? And then how well do we know the cost for our services? And then how well do we know the margins that we generate? And what that ended up doing was driving a whole new set of reporting in terms of what the business saw in terms of what we were doing. Not that this is anything that's rocket science, but I think you guys, anybody that's in the audience knows this, that it's next to impossible to run your organization if you don't know your costs. And you have to have good information about what you're spending money on, and also the importance of technology as it relates to providing you that information, and how important that is. And the more efficient that you can become to lowering your unit costs for services delivered, the greater the opportunity it is for your long-term survival. And so we went through some planning exercises, and if there were any one thing that I would tell you, say, well, what's a takeaway? This formula is something that it goes back actually to my days when I was with IBM. And it was something that as a sales rep and team, we had to do planning. This methodology will let you solve any problem that you want to do. It's a problem solving tool, but it basically forces you to think through how do you want to do this. The goal is to do what, the objective is how much by when, so it becomes quantifiable. And then the question is, what are the obstacles that stand in the way of you achieving your goal and objective? The next things that fall under that are the solutions. It's just broadly what it is. The real difficult part is how should you implement the solution, and that's the strategy part, and then the action steps. If you work backwards now and say, if I do this and it implements a solution that ultimately implements a solution that the strategy and solution that overcomes the obstacle, and the answer is, will I achieve what I want? If the answer is yes, then you've done a good job. If the answer is no, and you say, well, there's other things to do, then you're missing an obstacle. And then you answer the same questions. But what it will ultimately let you do is it will let you problem solve. And in its own way, it takes the emotion out of what's there. And so it's a wonderful tool to use. And if you've never tried it, I would encourage you to do it. But it's a nice takeaway from the hour that you're going to spend on this webinar today. In terms of things that what we had to do and what we expected, we knew that we had to invest in technology to become more efficient. That was just an absolute requirement. We knew that we had to embrace continual improvement because the way that we were doing things, if we continued to do it, the costs were just going to completely gobble us up, and that was going to be a problem. And we knew we had to figure out a way to control our own destiny and spend money on things that mattered and things that provided value and what we were supposed to do. And so it became all right, what are we going to spend money and what controls are we going to put in place to make sure that we're spending money in the right places? And so that by itself, as we started to look at that, we realized we had some things we had to change too, because we didn't have very good visibility to the information and the financial statements. So we changed those and helped us look for trends to look at what was different. But we also wanted to be transparent so that people could see how they were approving things and how their behavior and decisions drove results, because not everybody understands that. And once we began to show that, then people could begin to know that their actions were showing up, and this is where their actions and approvals were. And that was one of the positive things that I think came out of that. For those of you who've not done margin reports, here's the formula. It's really simple, but it tells you basically what your margin is by program. We do it by every program, and it's next to impossible to have a surplus if you don't have margin. And so I share that as just a pretty easy takeaway in terms of what's there. One of the things that we put in place when we talk about controlling how people spent money is years and years ago, I will acknowledge that the CEO of Delta did this, and I read about it in the Wall Street Journal, and I thought, well, that's a pretty good idea. So I acknowledged that the guy announced it in some interview that he was at in the paper, but they had a very, very tight approval structure with regard to what was going on with money, and anything that was $500 or more, the CEO signed off on, and so it became a wonderful learning exercise for the organization. And in essence, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get people to treat the money that they spend like it's their own, and if they do that, then the judgment and the understanding of does it provide value is something that I think is really critical. And so I pass that along as something that we did, and it helped us get control over expenditures. Other things in terms of what we had to do is we had to figure out how to reinvest in the business. So we kind of did a two-prong approach. We said, all right, let's take a look at our programs and let's target break even at operating all of our programs and working with what we have, and then let's change how we go out and raise money in terms of fundraising, so that we have money to reinvest in technology, as well as wage increases that sadly we hadn't given in, I think, 7 or 8 years that we'd gone before we got here where that was the case. I will tell you that's not the issue now. Other issues that lowered operating costs, and I mentioned this when I gave this last presentation, is in particular we put insurance out for competitive bid. A lot of times brokers ask to represent you as a broker of record, and then they go out and solicit all the bids, and then they come back and they bring you the lowest cost, and you really don't have any choices. I put brokers and let them compete against one another and only allowed them to have 3 insurance providers as part of their portfolio representation to us. The competition helped lower our costs. And I will tell you that was one of the lessons that I learned and had done in the past. And if you're not doing that, I'd encourage you to give some thought to it, because we saved, in the first year that we did that, we saved several $100,000 in operating costs just based upon having competition for insurance when we hadn't had that in the past. Other things that had to change and problems that we had to encounter was that Monica noted this in her article today, but there was a culture change that had to get embraced, and that we were on a journey. We established a value statement as something I think is really important, that defines what we do. It defines how we treat each other. It defines those that interact with us, what they should expect of us. And it just kind of said, okay, this is how we're gonna conduct ourselves as an organization. The other thing that came about in terms of the challenges of the organization was it became very apparent that we hadn't done a very good job of telling our story, and that I hear others say, well, we're a well-kept secret. The families and the communities that we support, and the people that could provide donations to hopefully become inspired by our work, we had to tell people what we were doing. If there was any one lesson that I would tell you that we've learned from our own approach to things, is telling and providing information on social media and our website, and literally making it a daily event, has been incredibly powerful. And it takes daily attention. It is not something that you can just, publish on a weekly or every other week and then hope that it stays there. It has to be something that you are committed to. And basically we as a business, we are consciously trying to tell one story a day as to what we do and how we do it. And it's interesting, the impact and the perception is that the work that we do hasn't changed, but the perception of our work is changing dramatically, because we're doing a better job of letting people know what we're doing. And so I would share that as a takeaway. If you're not doing that, give that some serious consideration. The other thing about becoming lean, if you will, if you have the mindset, well, we're going to touch data one time, and when we're going to do a task, we're going to do it one time, on time, and every time. And you think of the systems that you have, that you make sure that you're not doing redundant data entry, and you're not pulling the same information from multiple areas, but you're capturing information once and then making sure that once you have it, then it's shared within the system, and you make sure that you're doing it that way. If you just look at how you enter and utilize data and how you then translate that into information, that is part of the lean mindset. And what you're trying to do is just eliminate non-value added activities. We looked at things that we were doing, and in particular, we had some reporting that was going on, that we were capturing the information, throwing it into a 3-ring binder, capturing information, quite honestly, in 15-minute increments. And then we never looked at it. We never analyzed it. We never reported on it. And it was like, well, why are we doing this? And on top of that, the likelihood of information being captured every 15 minutes, with the way that we were trying to do it, it probably wasn't accurate. And so we just stopped. And when we stopped, it freed up time and made jobs better. It's logical, but there are things sometimes they're there and have been done for a reason. We've been done forever, so you just keep doing it. But you have to have the willingness to look at it and say, well, that makes no sense, and change it if that's the case. In terms of initiating change and implementing change, one of the things that I've learned is people will accept change when they have a better understanding as to why they're doing what they're doing, and communication can certainly help manage this. And for those of you that are in the situation where you have an opportunity to be able, we looked at doing monthly, quarterly updates to our employees in the beginning. We had a thing that was actually kind of cool and it worked out really good, was that as we were initiating change, we would invite employees in to have pizza, and I would just basically walk in with a yellow pad, sheet of paper and a pen and with nothing on it and say, well, what do you want to talk about? And we would begin to just talk about the organization, and I'd find out about things that could get better, and we would begin to make changes. If you're not doing an annual employee meeting talking about where you're at and where you're going and recognizing your employees, if you're not doing that, I would say it's a missed opportunity. Give it some consideration, because I think you'll find that while it takes some work to pull together, it's something that people grow to enjoy and appreciate getting an update and learning more about where you're at and where they're going, and that's a good thing. In terms of communication and leadership with your team, everybody has their own systems in terms of how they oversee and how they work with people. My system is one that was shared with me years ago, and I meet with my immediate direct reports 2 times a month. We talk about what's working, what's not. We talk about what are they doing to deliver on the things that they're supposed to. What's open for discussion is how we're able to accomplish what we need to, not the objectives that we've mutually agreed to say, here's what we're going to do. So what it really lets an individual do is kind of be in control of their own destiny, to the extent of being able to say, hey, we need to do this, and this is what we're trying to make happen. And if you go by the premise that, treat people the way you want to be treated, well, I know I want the flexibility to be able to make decisions and be able to control where I'm headed. I know that's what I want personally, and so I try to do the same thing for the people that I'm responsible for. What we're trying to accomplish isn't up for debate, as you can see, but how we do it and what the recommended plan is within their purview. And so that's what we try to make happen. The other thing we do is that we have a monthly meeting where we talk about change and improvement management, and everybody gets to come in and talk about what are the things that they've implemented over the past month. And it's really interesting how this works, because this is really peer pressure, because nobody wants to appear that they haven't done anything. And so what ends up happening is things begin and energy grows from this. These meetings become really kind of inspirational, because you hear some really cool things that are happening, and it's kind of exciting. And that's one of the things that helps the business grow as well. Now, other lessons that I want to share, and this comes from the for-profit sector, and particularly in manufacturing, but I will tell you, paying attention to details is so critical. And a lot of times, you'll say you're too busy to pay attention to that, but then at the same time, are you too busy to have to do it again? And one of the things that I learned in manufacturing products and selling them all over, and it was you can make good money if you have a good product, you have distribution, your manufacturing's good, you do the fundamentals right, you can make good money. But if you want to make great money, you do things right, and you really pay attention to details, so that you're not doing things a second time. And years and years ago, I actually had the privilege of going to a class that was taught about materials that was written by a book, or written by an author by the name of Philip Crosby, and the book was entitled "Quality is Free." And the thing that stuck with me, and it's really interesting if you go to do this, that the cost of nonconformance to quality is roughly 20% of your business, and 20% of your business costs. And because the contention is that you're doing things redundantly and you're not being smart about how you're doing. It's really interesting when you begin to look at automation and you look at other opportunities. What I can tell you is, it may not be 20% in your business because you're efficient and effective and you thought these things, but I will guarantee you that the cost of quality is more than you think, and it can it can add up faster than what you realize. And so I would encourage you to look for those opportunities, and if you can fix them, you're gonna take cost out of your operating model. The one thing about financials and numbers, one of the things that I've learned is that the numbers tell you where to look, but they don't tell you why. And so the key question then becomes, if something's out of whack, where it's out of whack against budget or out of whack against plans, and you see a variance that doesn't make sense, ask the question and then begin to drill down as to understand why. And if you do, it will be time well spent. Other applicable lessons that you saw in Monica's article about the sense of urgency and the importance of driving change. Trust the data that you have, but as I said, make sure you know why. And then having a business plan gives you direction. And the important thing is this, is that you start with assumptions, and your plan has to be flexible, but understand that the plan is intended to mitigate risk. You will never come up with a plan to eliminate it. But if you look at the perspective of mitigating risk, which is really what you're trying to do, you're trying to improve your odds of success. And so with that being said, hopefully the thought process and what you go through makes it all worthwhile for you. In terms of where's Little Friends today and how's this worked, we've paid off the line of credit. We've got money in savings. We've invested in new technologies, and we have new electronic health record systems. We've acquired a new facility and invested a great deal of money in new schools. We have more SILAs. We've added another program. CQL is accredited and reaccredited us again in this past year. We went through it's interesting, as part of Open Minds, and we used them in a planning exercise. They did a financial sustainability index evaluation of our organization, and our organization in short order has had the sustainability perspective that we were better than a AAA bond in terms of the evaluation of the organization. We're proud of that because it's the reflection of a great deal of work of a lot of people. We just recently purchased a building next door. We have some exciting initiatives we want to implement to try to help young adults whose needs are less significant between the ages of 18 and 35 to try to help them with employment. And we're going to continue to look for opportunities where we can get better, but the pursuit of continual improvement is here for us, and will be here for a long time, just because we always know that we can get better. We're not acknowledging that we do everything perfect. I wish that were the case, but it's not. But we've made improvements, and we'll continue to do that from there. So with that being said, that's the story at this point. And I guess, Ken, questions or anything you'd like to throw out, we'll go from there.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. And if anyone has questions, I encourage you to put those into the chat. We want to be able to capture those. It's a great opportunity to just ask Mike directly some thoughts based upon his presentation here. You know, as we're waiting for a couple of those questions to come into the chat, Mike, I'm thinking of this concept of urgency. You've mentioned that a couple of times, and we know in the article that Monica put together that came out this morning, it talked about urgency, John Cotter's perspective on change management. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of the change you're bringing? Because it seems like you need to make that case of urgency to different stakeholders. You might need to have a plan for your board. You might need to have a plan for key officers in your organization or for managers. So you could talk a little bit about that urgency piece and how you were able to establish that. Folks might know that things maybe need to change, but how do you get them to really engage in understanding that steps need to be taken, and drastic steps sometimes?
So it's an interesting challenge and an interesting question, because how you present it to everybody can vary depending upon the position of the stakeholders and quite honestly the vested interest that somebody has in a particular program. From my vantage point, emotions in particular, an emotional connection is something really becomes the stumbling block to get over if something's not performing well, because the idea of saying, well, we've always done that and we can't get rid of that becomes a issue that really becomes a very difficult discussion. Facts become very important, and you have to be able to lay out, here's the past performance, this is the future performance anticipated based upon what we know. Even with changes, this is what needs to happen. And then you begin to lay that out, but you stay true to what you're doing. We were fortunate enough, our board, when presented with facts, said, okay, here's what we need to do. They embraced a willingness to take some risk, which is good, where we needed to make some investments in things, because quite honestly, if we didn't invest in technology and look to gain improvements in efficiencies, we were never going to lower our operating costs, which was really going to be the stranglehold on the organization. So it became a matter of selling risks and then being willing to be held accountable to the things that you were asking for. And that was clearly one of the things that we had to go through. And there is accountability. Once you ask for something and get that, you've got to make sure that you deliver on what you say you're going to do.
Yeah. You mentioned the concept of technology being so key to your financial sustainability. And I think we would all agree with that. In fact, technology and the opportunities related to technology now are, one, accelerating, and two, really impact not just operations and efficiency, but how we deliver services. We're talking about working with individuals with disabilities, giving more independence. I mean, there's so many types of technology, and certainly that does play into sustainability. Can you talk a little bit about technology, how you brought technology in to create that financial sustainability? I'm thinking that, one, it takes some investment. There are so many options. How do you know what options? And just talk a little bit about how you've kind of brought technology and gotten people on board and brought that into the organization.
Okay, so I would break it down to, if you look at what you need to operate your business, what are the fundamental technology tools that you've got to have to be able to be as efficient as possible? And if you look at the administrative side, you look at your record keeping, your reporting, what are all the operational things that you need? So now you're talking about EHR, you're talking about what kind of communication tools, your financial systems, your information with regard to your donors, which is part of your revenue stream. What are all the things from an operational standpoint that you need from that vantage point? Then the other side is, what are the tools that are needed for the people that you serve? And that's a whole nother part of things that we invested in and chose to. So I think you got to look at it in chunks. I don't think if you just look at the broad subject and you don't have a focus on what you're trying to do, it's pretty difficult. I will tell you, we looked at it in chunks just because that was what we could digest. And then that also became what we could implement in terms of change. One of the things that's really, I think, it's a subtlety, but it really is important, is how do you manage change in your organization as you implement these things? How do you make sure that you not only get it and are in a position to buy it, but then how do you make sure it works? And how do you make the necessary investments to get the return that you expect based upon what you're trying to do? But Ken, I would look at it, to start, I would look at it, what's the operational side, and then what's the services side, and then break those up into manageable chunks that you could get your arms around.
Yeah, okay. All right, so really looking at a couple types of technology and working that into that sustainability approach. Some of those core messages and initiatives that you identified, and figuring out how technology supports them. And you talked also just from, I think you used the term organizations being, the best kept secret, and I'm sure that was true of Little Friends. I hear that frequently of organizations. We provide quality services. You know, we've been around for a long time. The consumers we serve love us, but you know, people just don't know about us. And so you talked about some of the marketing and that really being a daily focus. How did you build that up? I'm sure that takes some resources. It takes some focus from you, maybe from some focus from others. Where additional resources needed. I hear you saying marketing is a really big piece. Marketing being getting the message out about what you're doing, who you are, how you're having impact. You want to talk a little bit more about that aspect, kind of that external piece of aligning people, stakeholders with your.
Let's let me be honest, so that that while I'm absolutely endorsing the idea of doing it daily. How it came about was something that we were in a battle with in our city where we were at. We were trying to sell property in a historic district in which certain neighbors had decided to say things that weren't very flattering about the organization and me, and using social media as a means to deliver those messages. And we needed to in today's world, when stuff like that happens, you have to figure out how do you, if you will, fight back and communicate if something's said that's erroneous. How do you tell your message? And so we kind of sat down and said, well, we've got a problem. We need to address this. And what we wanted to do then was we made a commitment because of this and what was going on we're going to tell a positive thing about us every day. That's just what we're going to do. And we're going to hang our hat on the work that we do, but we're going to now, instead of maybe publishing something once every 1 or 2 weeks, every day we're going to be committed to doing that. And to tell you the truth, by making that commitment and doing that in the beginning, we did it to address our efforts to try to sell the property, which eventually we did. But what we learned through the process was the importance and the significance of sharing those positive stories, because it began to influence how people perceived what we were doing. And what it was we were just making the information available, and we hadn't been as aggressive as we were in the past. And so, I mean, as much as I'd love to tell you that it was a stroke of brilliance, it was really in reaction to a situation where we wanted to take the high road in terms of how we presented ourselves. And in doing so, the lesson that we learned was so powerful that it's become something that it's just common that we do now multiple times a day. We're actually in a program that we're excited to get involved with the University of Chicago and alumni from their School of Business that are going to help us create and understand the measurements and the metrics associated with the impact of our work. And while we do a decent job, we can do better. And so I'm really excited about this, because I've kind of seen, if you will, the light, and that we need to do a better job and can. And I'm anxious for the help that'll come from that consulting support they're going to provide us.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I really appreciate you telling that story about, in essence, how adversity really moved you into understanding the need to be communicating on a regular basis, communicating positively. And sometimes it's adversity that brings us to that point. And then we can build that plan and learn from the fact, as you did, that, you know, daily outreach, and it doesn't have to be a big marketing campaign, that there's a role for that, but often it's just tapping into social media on a regular basis and building those positive thoughts. What I'm also, you know, struck by what you're saying is that sometimes it's just, you know, that positive image, building that positive image, maybe using social media, connecting with people, changing their perception. But what you're doing also with the study with the University of Chicago is, you know, establishing kind of the return on investment. What's the return? What's the investment in Little Friends, the return that it brings to the community? And I think both of those are important messages, really connecting around how you impact people, but also the value you bring to your community. So I think that a couple of really important things to keep in mind in terms of bringing change, sustainability around that marketing piece and the role for marketing. You mentioned unit costs a couple times as well, and of course, being having a background in finance and working with a number of CFOs around understanding our unit costs, I think that that's a really key component of driving a bottom line overall. So just talk a little bit more about that, because there's a kind of a financial side and the financial calculations of coming up with unit costs. As long as you kind of divided things out, that's pretty easy. But communicating that to people, identifying opportunities for change, driving change, kind of building a continuous change program around unit costs, that's more of the challenge. So any other thoughts you have to share about how do you utilize unit costs to engage people and bring about some of that change?
I think we in the beginning, what we would do is we'd break down our P&L, and we'd break it down by the specific areas. We knew the number of people that we served in each program, and then we could take the elements that supported those individuals and looked at, if you will, it was simple math where we said, okay, this is what we spend. I'll use an example on nursing to support X number of people. And this is what we found, what the industry currently does. This is where we are against the industry. Help me understand why we're doing what we're doing. And I know that was something that we looked at years ago, and then we made some changes based upon looking at our costs to provide that kind of support. What it really helps is that as you begin to have conversations, you look at it on a cost per person, the cost per person served. And it just provides a different kind of narrative to the discussion to say, is that a good investment? Is that right? Or can we do it for less money? Is there another way to do it? It begins those kinds of conversations. Sometimes they're very difficult, but at the same time, it just gives you the framework as to how to be able to talk about situations where maybe change is warranted. And you haven't looked at it before that way. And I don't know if that makes sense, Ken, but that's kind of how I used it. And I would run my total program costs, and then if there was an issue, then I would go into the detail and say, okay, this is what we spend on this, and this is how this translates, and then how does this compare if we were to get this in a different way? And so that was how we would look at stuff.
Yeah. And that goes back to those key principles of change management. Be able to have the data and just let the data speak, engage people around the data, and help them understand their role in the data overall and what they can do to change. And those are some of the notes that I took down as well. We often think about understanding our unit costs as being kind of this financial wonky kind of thing. And the creation of those is important, but everyone understanding the impact on our bottom line, on our sustainability, that's where I think the real leadership can happen. And you, having come from a manufacturing background, I'm sure that you spent time daily kind of understanding what's driving our unit costs right now, and what's variable and what's fixed, and how do we engage people on the front line to maintain and change those unit costs. So I think that's an important part.
I think that, to me, the question then becomes, well, is there another way to deliver this? And especially when you challenge, when the organization is challenged to figure out how do you live within the means that you have, you begin to look at those functional parts, you break it down, and then you can ask a question, say, well, is there a cheaper way to do this and still just as good? And we make sure that quality doesn't suffer and hopefully improve? And can you do it in a different way? And what's the answer to that question? And it's just having those conversations and kind of working through that process.
Yeah. And, I think a lot of organizations have been successful at doing that by bringing some of the consumer-facing staff from different departments, maybe bringing a finance person and a tech person and a direct service person, maybe a clinician, bringing them all to the table because they each have some idea of their perspective of the process. But when you get everyone together, maybe map that process out, look at the costs, you can begin to identify opportunities to reduce those costs, make things more efficient. So I agree with you. That is really a key step towards financial sustainability. And encourage folks, we only have a couple minutes left. If you have any questions, please put those in the chat. Just thinking about overall investment strengthening, you talk about where Little Friends is at this point in time. And I know that that's a process overall. You mentioned, Open Minds does an assessment where we look at a not-for-profit's financial statements, and we do some calculations and align the organization based upon the bond rating scale. You mentioned recently some work where you positioned through that calculation at a AAA bond rating, which really is excellent. Few organizations really get to that point. It's based upon having cash on hand, an adequate level of debt, your ability to cover interest payments, and profitability overall, which ties into the service portfolio perspective that you have. Just wanted to give you a chance with the last couple minutes that we have here to just say anything around just the strengthening, how that has prepared you now for opportunities. We think in terms of financial sustainability, preparing us strategically to continue to change and develop new programs and the like, and just give you an opportunity to just talk about, where you're at now, you're stronger than you've been in a long time. How does that position you for the future?
Well, I mean, the obvious answer is better, but I think that there are a couple things. Is that it allows us to pursue opportunities that maybe we wouldn't have been able to pursue in the past. It allows us to evaluate new services, new programs, possible new locations. It allows us the possibility to have conversations because we have infrastructure in place to have conversations about tuck-ins, if that makes sense for someone else, depending upon where their business is. I do believe that there's advantages to scale. I personally believe that if you bring two organizations together and neither one of them are doing well, I've seen it in the for-profit side. What you get when you add the two doesn't all of a sudden turn into efficiencies. And so you got to have your act together before you can even begin to have discussions about can you bring something else in the organization. So if you were to think about big picture strategy, we had to get well. And then once we got well, we're now beginning to position ourselves to do the next kinds of things. And then the next kinds of things are questions of, do we do more of what we currently do? Do we consider going into something different that's not in our service portfolio, but we have an aptitude to do? I tend not to personally want to get into something that somebody else is doing really well, and especially if you don't have the skills and the bandwidth to be able to do that. I'd rather create an alliance and let somebody else do that, and then have it be complementary, and then we just figure out how to take better care of the families and the people we care for those kinds of things. And we've done that with some stuff. But I think being in a position where you can begin to have those discussions and look at that enables the organization, I think, to think a little bit freer than worrying about, well, how are we going to be able to, pay the heating bill tomorrow? And we're at least fortunate, knock on wood, I don't take that for granted, but we have to continue to keep working hard and keep doing what we're doing so that we remain in a position where we can do those kinds of things and have those kinds of opportunities and discussions.
Well, Mike, I do agree with you that having financial strength creates the opportunity for long-term sustainability, drives better strategy. And you certainly have given us a lot to think about in terms of your experience, your leadership in creating some sustainability and basically leading through change and positioning your organization for the future. So I thank you for your presentation today. And I think we're going to pass it back to Corey for the last minute here. I think he has a slide to talk about our next webinar in the series. But thank you so much, Mike, because great insights, and I always enjoy presenting with you.
You're more than welcome. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Ken, Mike, thank you. And I want to thank everybody who attended today. I want to also remind everybody that the slides and the recording will be available tomorrow on the Open Minds website. The full Circle Elite Executive Roundtable series is also on demand as part of the extensive Open Minds library. And finally, next week, please join us on Thursday, March 23rd at 1 p.m. Eastern for Preparing for Cal AIM. Where have we been and where are we going? A California update. For a full list of all upcoming roundtables, you can visit the Executive Roundtables page, which is listed under the Events tab at www.openminds.com. Mike, Ken, thank you again, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.